Welcome back, class. Having a little trouble telling whether you can hear me or not, but we're going to talk for a few minutes about problem solving and decision making when you're in a global culture. And on page 145 in the text, they have a really nice chart that lays everything out for you. So uh, should be able to um, understand what they're talking about. Um, and it walks you through and compares, what the American culture looks like, and then compares it to non-Western culture. So when they say non-Western cultures, they're including America, Western Europe, in the and kind of in the Western culture. Um, and the first one is in the American culture, difficult situations should be viewed as problems to be solved. And that's just what our culture is built on. And if you're already in a leadership you know role somewhere, or you may have already experienced this. I mean, think about what happens to you on a daily basis in leadership role. you know Continual problems that you have to solve. You have to solve those problems, get it done, and move on to the next one. If you want to move into a leadership role or a leadership capacity, get ready for it, because that's the even though I've seen even though I guess I have seen it move in a little different direction over the years, it's still that's still just the culture that we have here in the United States. Um, and if you're talking about, compare that to a non-Western, they talk about acceptance of and dealing with problematic situations. It's the way that they actually are. And so that's the way they solve the problems, and that's their decision-making process. So if you are fortunate enough to attain a leadership role in a global a business economy, and you've got some of your team that that live or domestically located in one of the other countries outside of the United States, don't be surprised if they take that attitude when it comes to solving problems. And the second one I really like, it says get it in writing. We're a litigious, environment here in the United States. It's just kind of the way it is, and everybody wants something in writing. Everybody wants, somebody makes a decision that, that you think may not be the right one. It's like, well, just send me an email of what you want me to do, or copy me on an email of how you want this laid out. And that's the way that we do business here in the United States. In a non-Western culture, it's relationship and trust building. And while we do it in writing, it's more of a handshake. It's more trust and relationship building in a social environment. So just understand that, again, the authors keep talking about context, and that's what they're trying to drive home when it talks about context. The third one is linear or sequential thinking when working through the issues of a deal. And that's the way we are. We think about it. When I worked for Aetna, I led a team that developed networks, the provider networks in Southern California. And you would go into a negotiating table, and it was just the way business was done. You might have had a 40-page, contract with the hospital, and you're sitting across the table with their negotiator, and you start at the very top. And it's like, here's the terminology, here are the parameters, here's this, here's that, here's how long the contract lasts. And you walked it all down step by step. And the reimbursement rates, or what you were going to pay the provider, pay the hospital for healthcare goods and services that we were buying as a healthcare company at Aetna, that was one of the very last things that you did. You went through all of this legalese, page after page of the stuff, and then the actual nuts and bolts or what really drove that negotiation were the rates at the end of the day. And that's like the last, you go through the contract, and then there's a bunch of appendices or and like appendix XXXX or whatever that one of the last ones appendix happened to be, or addendums, depending on how the contract was worded, that was when they talked about the rates. And that was, probably one of the most important aspects of that contract was driving those rates home. So that, from my perspective, so that Aetna came out on top, and for the hospital's perspective, so the hospital came out on top. So that's the kind of linear sequential, thought process that we go through here in the United States. And if you're a non-Western, they integrate. It's a holistic thinking when working through a series of the issues of a deal. And they may, bounce around and, work because and if you go back to the hospital contract, I can kind of understand if you can't get the rates negotiated, why do you even go through the page after page of legalese leading up to the rates? So it's just a different way of doing business and a different way of negotiating if you're in a non-Western country. The number 4, it's relatively frequent delegation of decision making. And we talked about that in some of the earlier chapters. As a leader, when do you give up control? When do you relinquish control? When do you bring your in group into a meeting and delegate or facilitate, and because you're trying to grow and groom them to take over or to at least move up the corporate ladder. And in non-Western cultures, decision making is by the management only. You're not going to have individuals in a non-management position making decisions on how the company runs in a non-Western culture. In the United States, quick, sometimes bold decision making. If you compare that to a non-Western culture, it's like that, what they call it, paralysis by analysis. It's slow, it's risk averse decision making because they are looking at it from every angle, trying to figure out, how is this going to impact us moving forward? And then the last one, it's leaders help followers solve problems and provide answers for themselves. Again, it goes back to how do we delegate? How do we delegate control? How do we relinquish control? How do we help and train our followers to be more productive and to move up the corporate ladder? In a non-Western culture, it's leaders are supposed to be the experts, so they're expected to have all the answers. And I think if you go down through these and, kind of work your way through them, you see this a lot. We've seen it over the years in movies and read about it over the years in different, fiction books or different biographies or autobiographies. And I think it's just probably a way of life that we all understood, but I've never seen it laid out quite like this in a text. So I actually like the way they've got it laid out, and it makes a lot of sense, especially if I were thinking about taking a position in a global company. And as they go down through it, then they bounce back and they provide some comments about each of these 6 steps. And if the comment on step number 1 is solve quickly or held accountable, just like constructing a plant. You've got to, if you're constructing a new plant, you've got to get that thing up and running. Time, we talked about, time is money. Time is money when you're constructing a plant, and that's why you've got to get it going. And then the second one, America is a litigious society. Sign contract rather than, building trust through social activities. Number 3 is sequential or linear rather than, negotiating simultaneously. Number 4 is delegate versus non-delegated. And I think we pretty much worked through that one. Number 5 is quick decisions versus paralysis, again, by analysis. And that's just it's a risk-averse process in a non-Western type culture. And then the last one is delegate versus leader have all the answers. And I think a lot of these are pretty straightforward. I think a lot of them make a lot of sense, and we probably all thought through them at one time or another. And I think that they make a lot of sense. But I really like the way they've laid it out. And if you ever do decide to go work for a global type company, maybe it's something you want to keep in your back pocket. The bottom line through all of that is know your own culture. First step is to know one's culture. The second step is to understand how global culture impacts personal life as well as work setting. And that, again, it's extremely important if you're going to be successful with a global company, is you have to understand how that culture that you're going to be functioning in impacts not only your business decisions or the success of your business decisions, but how's it going to impact your life from a social perspective. And, if you're single, maybe it's not that big a deal, but if you take a family overseas with you to live, it is extremely vital and extremely important to understand how those cultures are going to impact the social aspect with respect to your family. And then they spend a few minutes talking about global leadership orientation. And its participative leadership works in Western cultures. Doesn't, work so much in Asian cultures. Paternal approaches work in Asian cultures. They more like kind of like the government is here. The leaders in an Asian culture may think they know more. They may know what's better off for all of their followers without giving their followers the opportunity to participate in decision-making processes. Visionary, inspirational leadership works in most cultures. Know-how and emotional engagement impacts cultural requirements. And that's, again, comes back to the social aspect and the cultural requirements. You're going to be functioning as a representative of the company that you work for, and you have to be aware of how you're supposed to interact both socially and cultural events. Effectiveness requires leaders to make sense of changing situations and interactions with diverse stakeholders. And it is truly a diverse population. Once you get outside, it's a diverse population here in the United States from a business perspective. If you're currently a leader, you understand that. But you're talking about a different dynamic once you get outside the United States and how that changes and how you manage those diverse relationships. And then lastly, it's the impact of government interference and laws and regulations. And maybe that should have been at the top of the list. I don't know. It's going to depend on, again, leader, follower, context. It's going to depend on what that context is, what that situation is, which country you're trying to function in. And every country has some unique and creative laws and regulations, and you're going to have to get to the point, if you're a global leader, to understand those unique laws and regulations. Global, and then they I think this is where they're trying to tie it together, and they talk about global orientation factors, global business know-how, and that's number one on their orientation factors, knowledge of industry level aspects and areas. So you have to understand the industry or the market or industry, depending on how you want to look at it, that you're going to be functioning in once you land on your feet in a leadership role or leadership capacity with the global company. And it's, again, it goes back, you have to understand global regulations. You have to understand non-business norms. When you go out to a social engagement, or you're representing the company at some time in a type of an event, you have to be aware of what is, they talk about it being kosher, you have to be aware of what is, the expectation and how you should behave and how you should approach individuals, especially a social gathering. You have to understand the cross-cultural know-how. And this is where if you immerse yourself in that culture, you get a fairly good understanding of politics and religion and art and history, because these are kind of, conversation points that could come up at these social events or social engagements, then you as a leader have to be able to understand enough about that culture that you can converse intelligently when these conversation opportunities arise. And then you have to have you need a rudimentary knowledge or rudimentary knowledge. And they talk about, as a leader, be curious, ask questions, act like you're interested, because the more curious you are and the more willing you are to ask questions and try to engage, it puts you in a better position with the culture that you're trying to immerse yourself in. Cross-cultural engagement, and this is where things sometimes get a little hinky if you're in a culture, a global culture, especially outside the United States. Engage people in groups from other cultures, and they talk about immersion, and it is, if you are immersing yourself in a new culture, you're going to learn a lot quicker than if you're a global leader with one foot in the United States and one foot in the global environment in which you're trying to function in. It's easier to learn the language. It's easier to understand the nuances of the language. You'll get to the point that you can understand the subcultures, history, politics. You'll start to fit in, and as you start to try to fit in, it's going to gain you some level of respect as you move forward. High degree of openness towards diversity, and that's going to be a significant driver in whether you're going to be successful or not. Don't set aside your cultural norms, but try to understand their cultural norms. It makes a lot of sense. Avoid negative judgments. Important. Remember, we've talked about negative judgments, knee-jerk reactions, attributions. That was in not chapter 9, I think it was in chapter 8. We talked about that, and it's the same thing in this global culture. Be careful with negative judgments. Be careful with the way that individuals that you interact with present themselves. Patriotism, nationalism combined with a global orientation. I'm proud to be an American. I'm proud that I live in the United States. And if I go to another country, I'm not adverse to talking about how proud I am to be an individual in the United States. But also, I try to combine it with some type of global aspect, trying to understand their culture. Tension between nationalism and globalism, it's a false dichotomy. Pursue both simultaneously. It doesn't have to be a tense situation. You're not, the individual that, let's say the individual sitting across the negotiating table, he or she's not an adversary. You have a job to do as a business leader for your company. They have a job to do as a business leader for their company. And it's just a negotiation process. It's not to be taken personally. It's a business decision, and it's part of the business cycle. And lastly, they talk about avoiding misinterpretations, and I could see how that could happen. Supposedly, those of us from the South can come across as being somewhat naive, somewhat dim-witted, somewhat a little slow on the uptake. And I think it's because we may talk a little slower. We may talk with that Southern accent that it may come across as being, a little laid back. But when you end up in a culture and you're trying to immerse yourself in that culture, don't be there with a lack of cultural self-awareness and a lack of awareness of other cultures. You don't want to misinterpret anything, because if you start misinterpreting aspects of that new culture, whether it's a business engagement or social engagement, it's going to impact you somewhere down the road. They talk about, poor communication. That is That is a killer when you're talking about another, working in the global economy and, talking about, functioning in another country's culture. Course of business or social interaction. And, you're going to probably behave, one way in one and one in the other. International business conducted in English. And that's what I said. Most business schools outside of the United States, everything's in English. That's the, English is the language of business. And be careful of judgments and attributions. Again, we talked about this in, again, I think it was chapter 8, and it is extremely important when you talk about it in chapter 9. And the last thing they talk about is avoid cultural blinders, making the mistake of assuming too many similarities between ourselves and those who come from a different culture. You can't assume that we're similar, that you're similar with others, that I'm similar with others. That's a grave mistake, and you've got to get past that. So, actually, to me, this again, I found this chapter to be an interesting chapter, and I hope some of you get the opportunity to work for a global company. I think it would be extremely exciting, especially if you've never been outside the United States. Now, it might be a little challenging that first trip or so outside the United States, but I think if I had the opportunity years ago, I would have definitely enjoyed the opportunity of working on a global company. And with that, we're going to close out chapter 10, and the next time we get together, we're going to be talking about chapter 11. Thank you.